Well, it's a pleasure to be here this evening, and I just thank you for tuning in wherever you are in the world or in the UK. And it's my pleasure to speak to you about this topic: is faith in God delusional? And I was reading in an article in The Guardian from 2017 by someone called Dean Burnett, who was writing about why religious belief isn't a delusion. But he started his article with these words. He said, if someone told you in all seriousness that they talk to invisible beings who control the universe, you'd probably back away slowly, nodding and smiling while desperately looking for the nearest exit or escape route. And if this person then said that that being wants to be in charge of your life, you'd probably do the same, but more urgently and with a view to finding the nearest police officer. And I wonder if that can, be sometimes people's view of those that talk about having a spiritual life or having a religious belief or a faith in God. It can seem just a little bit out of touch with reality. Are religious people simply those who have lost their grip on the real world and believe things that just really aren't real? And this idea, as Peter's already said, was popularized by Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, in which he essentially makes the point that religious belief is a form of psychiatric illness, which is a very dramatic claim to be making. Perhaps the writer and philosopher Robert Pirsig captures it well when he says, when one person suffers from a delusion, it's called insanity. When many people suffer from a delusion, it's called religion. And of course, the notion of being deluded has a current ring to it, especially in these days of COVID, especially in what you're going through in the Manchester area and beyond. Our notions of deities laughable. Why would God allow a global pandemic? Are religious people just mistaken and misled by things that seem to be real, but really are no help and have no bearing on life? Well, as we go through and as we begin to look at this area, I'd like to first start with a definition of delusion according to clinical practice, or at least one definition that's out there. And it defines delusion as the most extreme deviations in thought content, fixed false beliefs that are maintained despite objective evidence and logical argument to the contrary. Furthermore, the belief is not one ordinarily shared by others who have similar educational or socio-cultural backgrounds. So I thought that'd be an interesting definition that I'll refer back to as we go through this talk. And I'd like to look at three different angles. Firstly, is faith in God irrational? Secondly, is belief in God just a product of the brain? And thirdly, is belief in God a trick of the mind? So firstly, is faith in God irrational? Many people assume that to exercise faith is something that you do against your better judgment, where you're willing yourself to believe things that actually are irrelevant. To be a person of faith is to dispense with logic, and you can either be a thinker or you can be a person of faith. Well, if we take the face value meaning of faith to be trust in something or someone, we actually begin to see that everyone has faith in something, and not simply religious people. We actually entrust ourselves to all kinds of things: parents, friends, aeroplanes, doctors, vaccine programs, even scientific theories. And we do so not in the absence of evidence, but on the very basis of evidence, whether or not there is evidence to justify putting our trust in that thing or person. I wonder if right now many people's faith or trust is in those working towards a vaccine for COVID. And we do that not in the absence of evidence, but on the basis of the evidence of success of vaccine programs in the past. And and also of the success and reliability of the scientific method. We might trust a parent or a friend based on the lifetime of loyalty and love they've already shown us, or we might lack trust if they have let us down. But either way, the level of faith or trust is based on evidence. And so to be a Christian is not all that different to that. To be a Christian is not to put your trust in bizarre traditions that have no bearing on reality, but to be a Christian is to put your trust in a person, Jesus Christ, for whom there is concrete evidence. This is someone who entered human history. And when people chose to follow Jesus in first century Palestine, this was not on the absence of evidence. It was on the basis of the evidence that they saw of his life, how he treated people with dignity and brought people from the margins of society back into the center, how he healed people and set them back on track with their lives, and how he even reached into death itself and raised people from the dead. And it was on the basis of that kind of evidence that people put their faith in Jesus. This extraordinary God-man was the real deal and could be trusted. And so this is not seen as an act of delusion by those that take it, but a response to the evidence, a response to a person. And so if we look back to our original definition of delusions as being fixed false beliefs held despite objective and logical evidence to the contrary, we see actually that to be a Christian is to do the opposite of that, because there's all kinds of evidence available today and logical argument as well. One kind of evidence that you see from this slide is archaeological. If you were to go to Israel and Jerusalem, if you wanted to do a building project in that area, you have to dig down first before you can build up, and just check that you're not building over some crucial archaeological site. There's also experiential evidence, the stories of how God is working today. If God is not real, then why are a third of the world's population following Jesus Christ? There are 2.2 billion followers of Jesus Christ around the world today, according to a 2011 Pew Research Centre Forum study on world religion. And this clinical definition says that deluded beliefs are not shared by other people who have similar educational and cultural backgrounds. And yet Christian beliefs are not only shared by people who have similar backgrounds, but they're also shared by people who have incredibly different and diverse backgrounds. The number of kinds of people around the world that profess to be Christians today could not be wider. And so what explains that? And then there are also eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. I guess we don't have a living, breathing person of Jesus in front of us, but we have historical accounts of his life that have been written down for us, as though they have been written as evidence for us to weigh and consider. One biographer, John, towards the end of his biography of Jesus' life, writes this. He says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And he says, here is the evidence. And read this account, and here is a lot of evidence. And it's interesting that if we want to discard the historical manuscripts as unreliable, we actually have to discard every other historical document that there is. And historians actually are in agreement that Jesus lived and died. The thing that they dispute is whether he rose from the dead, and we'll come to that later. And so with regard to the notion of faith, it is not the exercise of faith that is irrational, because everyone has faith in something. The question is whether or not there is good evidence to justify what your faith is currently in. But faith in God does not mean taking a blind leap into the dark and believing impossible things that we hope are true. Actually, to be a Christian means to examine the evidence and go where the evidence leads. So one of my questions to you this evening is, have you examined that evidence, or have you written it off on hearsay or on what you've heard other people say? Have you looked for yourself into the claims of Jesus? Well, let's move on to the second question I wanted to look at. Is religious belief just a product of the brain? You see, what happens in the brain when people pray? Well, over the last few decades, and again with the rise of neuroscience and various types of brain imaging, we've discovered that whilst people are engaged in all kinds of religious practices such as Buddhist meditation or Christian prayer, or even another form of Christian prayer known as praying in tongues, scientists have discovered that the brain is very active during religious endeavor, and there are many different brain regions and networks involved. Does this mean that neuroscience is showing us that religious experience is simply generated by the brain and therefore not real? Well, clearly it's showing us that religious practice and brain activity are connected. You know, you engage in a particular experience and you see a network of regions lighting up in the brain. Clearly what's going on in terms of religious belief and the brain, those two things are connected. But is religious belief just brain activity? Does this data show us that? Well, if religious experience and belief is just brain activity, this doesn't just call into question belief in God. This calls into question every kind of belief, and not just our beliefs, but also our personality and our choices and actions. Everything about us is dictated by the activity in our brains. If religious belief is just a product of the brain, every kind of belief is. And there are some very brilliant scientists that do believe this. You're probably familiar with Francis Crick, famous for co-discovering the DNA double helix along with James Watson in the 1960s, and a Nobel Prize winner. And he wrote later in another book that your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. Or in the words of neuroscientist and philosopher Sam Harris, who says more about the implications for free will, he says, how can we make sense of our lives and hold people accountable for their choices, given the unconscious origins of our conscious minds? Free will is an illusion. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from the background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. We do not have the freedom we think we have. The problem with this view, and especially when it comes to religious belief, is that if everything is simply coming from our brain, then the very expression of the view that religious belief is just a product of brain activity is itself just coming from the brain. You see, the person expressing this view is actually asking you not to believe them, because if everything is just driven by non-conscious neurons, then how can we read anything into what our consciousness throws out as a result? This view defeats itself. It is incoherent. It can't be that everything is just brain activity. This view defeats itself. And in fact, many would agree that it's not enough to simply talk about the brain. We need to also consider the mind. There are two different things in play, not just neurons and chemicals and hormones, but also thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories and decisions. And so a key question that we need to be asking is, what is the relationship between these two things? And this is not a new question that's suddenly been thrown open by the rise of neuroscience. This has been debated for centuries. The language of body and soul might have been used, but this is not a new question by any means. And it's known as the mind-brain problem. How do you get from brain networks to, oh, that conversation went really badly today? How do you get from cell voltages and chemical reactions to, what should we eat for dinner tonight? And, you know, despite throwing the brightest minds at this problem for centuries, there is no consensus on how you get from one to another. It's not that scientists and philosophers have got it all stitched up and sorted out. It's far from that. But many scientists and philosophers today would agree that chemical reactions and cell voltages are not enough on their own to explain the human mind. Let me try and show you why. Perhaps you've had one of these today. Imagine I were to ask you to describe to me the smell of coffee in physical terms. If all we've got to work with is physical processes, then I want you to describe to me the smell of coffee using those physical processes. And you might offer me the chemical structure of caffeine, and that would be very interesting, but it wouldn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. Or you might describe the physiology that's happening as it is absorbed into my body and digested, but that doesn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. You see, if you want to understand what coffee smells like, you need to smell it. And this is an example of a quale, or the plural qualia, which are qualitative experiences that are impossible to describe physically. And philosophers use this term to make the point that brain processes and human experience are two very different things. And this applies just as much to religious experience. We could think about romantic love, for example. What goes on in our brains when we are in love? Well, this was the title of an article from Scientific American in 2017, summarizing the research on neuroscience of love over the last 10 years or so. Neuroscientists now know that when you're in love, when someone is in love, a network of pleasure centers or reward centers are activated in the brain. And the summary in this paper put it like this: romantic love involves a series of complex changes in the brain's reward system that make us crave the object of our affection. But does this mean the experience of love isn't genuine? Does it mean the brain activity is the love? Well, not at all. You know, it's one thing to understand the brain's involvement in romantic love. It's quite another to experience the affections of someone. And just because you have a brain network to go with an experience, that doesn't provide a carte blanche for eliminating the experience. Those two things are very different. Does the presence of brain activity mean the relationship isn't real? It really doesn't, not at all. The fact that you know and understand the reward circuitry in the brain doesn't mean you call into question your spouse or girlfriend or boyfriend. In fact, the very fact that there is a relationship is the reason why there's brain activity in the first place. And similarly, it's the same with Christian belief and the networks that neuroscience is throwing out when we pray. Any brain activity during Christian prayer is to be understood within the framework of a relationship with God. In fact, it's absolutely what we should expect, that spiritual practices engage the brain. The Christian view of a human being is not of a robotic machine or even of a soul waiting to float off to heaven, but of an integrated physical and spiritual being. And so this is exactly what we should expect. In fact, if there was nothing going on in your brain while you're praying, I would be more concerned. Now, finally, let's just look briefly at the notion, is belief in God just a trick of the mind. This is a slightly different question, I think, thrown up in part by people like Darren Brown and his shows that kind of call into question the legitimacy and authenticity of religious experience. Brown is a talented illusionist who actually went to Bristol University. I think I may have even been at another Freshers event run by him in my hall of residence, whose work is based around the notion that experiences can appear to be supernatural, but they actually have a natural explanation. And Brown appears to be able to induce pseudo-religious experiences and healings using psychological techniques and the power of suggestion. And this might cause us to think, well, does that mean that people can be manipulated into having a religious experience? And if so, does that mean religious experience itself is not genuine? It's just a product of manipulations. And this is a very interesting area. We don't have long to go into it. There's a lot more that could be said, but at the very least, what Brown's work shows us is yet more evidence that you are way more than just your brain. The mind is powerful in its effect on the body, and your thought life can have a huge effect on your body in very powerful ways. Another example of this might be the placebo effect, that if you believe, if you're given a blank drug that you believe will help you, it will have some therapeutic benefit. This is another example of the power of the mind on the body. And Darren's work highlights the complexity of human beings, reminds us that we're biological, psychological, emotionally complex beings, that we're way more than just our brains. But the ability to artificially induce something akin to a religious experience in no way rules out authentic religious experience. Philosophers sometimes muse that if they were able to artificially stimulate the optic nerve to generate a visual experience of an apple, would this undermine the reality of apples? Well, no, it wouldn't. It would simply mean you've managed to artificially mimic something resembling an apple. You see, to determine if an encounter is authentic, we need to actually ask some more questions. We can't really assess authenticity in the moment. We need to ask, what type of encounter is it? Is it consistent with the wider set of beliefs held under that belief system? In this case, Christianity. Are there other examples of this? Can it be verified by other people? We also need to look at, most crucially, the long-term impact. You can't really assess authenticity in a moment. What we need to do is say, what kind of person is the result of this experience? Are there outward signs that change has happened in the person? How do they treat other people? What is happening in the real world? And the Bible talks about these outward signs of the work of God or the Holy Spirit in someone's life as fruit, which might be a strange way to refer to it, but it says that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. An incredible list of qualities. Do these sound like qualities that take people away from reality into the realm of delusion? Or are these qualities that actually would make a real difference if I had them in my life? My experience is that even my best efforts can't get me to these qualities consistently. In fact, I've come to realize there's only one human being that has ever fully lived all of these, and that is the person of Jesus Christ. You see, the Christian faith doesn't stand or fall on religious experiences. The Christian faith is actually anchored in human history and pivots around the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Did this God-man rise from the dead never to die again or not? If it happened, it changes everything. But if it didn't, then Christians are sadly mistaken. But one thing is certain. If it did happen, it couldn't have happened by the power of suggestion or by manipulation of the mind. We're talking about a bodily, physical raising from the dead that is beyond natural explanations. And it may be interesting for you to know that even some of those that knew Jesus were incredibly skeptical about his resurrection. One such person is Thomas, who said, unless I see the holes in his side, the marks in his hand, there's no way I'm believing this guy rose from the dead. And this Renaissance painting by Caravaggio captures the moment when Jesus gave Thomas the evidence that he asked for. And we see this incredible profession of faith by Thomas as a result, my Lord and my God. And then Jesus says to him, because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Thomas is skeptical. He asks for evidence, and Jesus gives him the evidence he asks for. And it results in a complete turnaround for Thomas. Just as I close, I could say how many people have changed their minds after looking into things in more detail. Lawyers, philosophers, scientists, journalists. One such person is Lee Strobel, previously an award-winning Chicago Tribune journalist in the 1980s, who underwent a 2-year investigation of all of the evidence himself, interviewed all kinds of people for alternative possibilities as to why that tomb was empty on Easter Sunday. He changed his mind as a result. In 1981, became a Christian and wrote his findings in the New York Times best-selling book that's recently been made into a film. And he says, I didn't become a Christian because God promised I would have an even happier life than I had as an atheist. He never promised any such thing. I became a Christian because the evidence was so compelling that Jesus really is the one and only Son of God who proved his divinity by rising from the dead. And that meant that following him was the most rational and logical step I could take. And so as I close, I leave you with this question. Have you considered the evidence? If it turns out all to be false, nothing is lost. But if it's true, it changes everything. If true, it means that Jesus has taken our brokenness onto himself on the cross and has buried our mistakes and our shame and guilt in the grave, which means that we can have forgiveness and know a new start in life. And it means that death doesn't have the last word in this universe. Death doesn't have the last word in this COVID pandemic. Jesus has defeated the ultimate enemy, the ultimate taboo that we don't even dare really talk about, but are desperately trying to avoid. And that means that there is full life now and beyond the grave for all those who choose to follow Jesus and put their trust in him. And that means we don't need to live in fear. We don't need to be afraid. And that's what I came to discover as an adult at the age of 20 in Bristol, in the middle of a biochemistry degree. And this is available to all. The possibility of new life and relationship with God is available to all. And perhaps as you're listening in, there'll be people at all different stages of their thinking on this. But it might be that you're listening and you've been thinking about this for a while, and actually you would like to respond to the evidence and to the person of Jesus. Can I encourage you to take heart from what happened with Thomas, who asked for evidence? Jesus responds, he hears our prayers. Be honest with him, be real with him, and ask him to make himself known to you. And I know that you won't be disappointed. Thank you for listening.